So the only orientation we need, it's been several weeks, is that they've been talking about the Aramaic term is Lashon Hediot, and it really means lay contracts. So contracts that weren't drawn up by rabbis using official language, but sort of informal contracts among neighbors. And would the rabbis enforce those contracts or interpret those contracts or see those contracts as being valid? So that's the general discussion. And it led us to a discussion about ketubas and an informal practice that apparently was widespread of inflating the amount of money you would put in the ketubah in order to offer honor to your bride, the bride you're going to marry. Because if the statutory amount is 200 zuz as in the ketubah that goes to the bride, remember the ketubah is money that goes to the bride in the event of a dissolution of the marriage, either by death or by divorce. So if you're required to put in 200, the groom's going to say to himself, well, that's the minimum. You know, I'm not just going to put the minimum in. I'm going to put $1 million in there just to show you how much I love her. And that was the kind of exaggerations they would use. And then the rabbis had to figure out, how do they adjudicate those things? You know, did he mean $1 million? Because then it would come, and then he would say, well, I didn't really mean $1 million. I meant 200. But if it was a widespread practice, then the rabbis had to sort of honor the widespread practice. And so I think I mentioned before that it's a practice that exists to this day. So there's the Syrian Jewish community, which will put inflated numbers there, and the Iranian Jewish community too. They'll put inflated numbers there, and the last thing they expect is for you to take those numbers seriously. So, it's just part of. I mean, in America, the ketubah can't be. I think I've talked about this too. In America, the ketubah is not a legal document; it's a religious document. So, and that's been taken to court and. So it doesn't matter. You could put $1 zillion, and you can't collect on a ketubah in America because there's a separation of church and state. But the question is, if you could, could you collect $1 million? And the Talmud is actually here saying no.
Is there a place on money ketubah for putting in money? I never noticed it.
Oh yeah. You have a ketubah? Do you know where your ketubah is? Yeah. Yes, if you bring it, I'll show you. Show you how much money you're in for.
You got to take inflation into account.
I'd be willing to bet it's 200 zuz. Yeah, because Ashkenazi Jews, for whatever reason, we're not as romantic as Sephardic Jews. We've kept to the minimum amount. This is what it is. That's all we're going to give. It's Sephardic Jews that became more romantic about it. No, I love you $2 billion worth. I don't really mean that, but we just kind of stick to the. We're not as romantic. But
so in ancient times, that would be 100 kids.
Yeah. There's ketubas that have stuff in it too, and there are. I mean, I've seen Syrian ketubas today. They don't just put in numbers. They put in houses and cars and yachts and everything, and they don't mean any of it either. It was really funny. The first time I did a wedding like that, it was an instruction for me. All right. Anyway,
the word for yacht.
Page 158. They would write it in. So I don't even remember if we've done this already. I think maybe we did a little bit of it, but 158. So this is a case. And they're analyzing this case, Ahu Gavra. So there was a guy, and you'll see Rashi explains that he's saying this on his deathbed. So Ahu Gavra Amarlu, and he said, Havula, give her, it's my daughter, Arba me'azuze, levirte, 400 zuz to my daughter, biktubata, inner ketubah. Okay, so the thing is, this was also a custom in these times, that the father of the bride would actually pay the amount of the ketubah. So the ketubah, without getting into too many details here, the ketubah would function as some guarantee for the bride, but also a dowry for the groom, because the groom would keep the money until there was a divorce, and then it would go to the bride. But it would be like an escrow. Theoretically, then, of course, the groom could even spend it, as long as he understood that it was a debt that ultimately owed it to his wife. So the father owed the daughter. When I say owed the daughter, it means he owed the marriage itself. Which means he owed that family. He owed his son-in-law whatever was the amount of the ketubah, and he hadn't paid it yet, and it's on his deathbed. So there's also some issues here about a deathbed saying, which has its own legal sanctions. But anyway, I'm just going to keep going here. So he says, give my daughter 400 for her ketubah. Or actually, how does he translate this? In her ketubah. Bi ketubata. Shalat, and then he dies. Right? That's his last words. So they have to figure out what to do with that statement. Shalach Rav Acha berei de Rav Avia. So they sent to Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia, lekame de Rav Ashi, and he said this in front of Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi was his teacher, but he made this ruling. He actually asked this question. Arba me'ah de'inun taname me'ah. So when he says 400 zuz, does he mean there's actually 800 in the ketubah? Because remember, in those days, in that community, the ketubah was always exaggerated. And there was a formula. If you put 800 zuz in the ketubah, then you would collect 400. Even though it said 800, you would collect formula because that was the accepted practice. Now, all we have is this guy's deathbed declaration. It says, give her 400 in the ketubah. So now the rabbis are trying to figure out, okay, what does the estate owe? Does the estate owe what he said? 400, meaning there's 800 in the ketubah. Oh, arba ame uzuzi de inun matan. Or is he saying there's 400 in the ketubah, which means he only owes half of that, 200. So it's an important question. Basically, the question is, does he owe 200 or does he owe 400? Now, presumably, they could just look in the ketubah. Let's say the ketubah is lost at this point. But the fact that he mentioned, which happens, so it happens. And just because the ketubah is lost doesn't mean you don't owe the money. It just means the ketubah is lost. So they don't know what's in the ketubah, and they're trying to figure out what he meant. So when he said 400, did he mean 400 or did he mean 200? Did he mean there was 400 in the ketubah, so that means I only owe 200? Or did he mean I give her 400, which means there was 800 in the original ketubah? Okay, that's the question. Now we have the answer. Amar Rav Ashi chazinan. So Rav Ashi says, well, here's how you figure it out. The actual term there is look, but he doesn't mean look in the ketubah, because obviously if you had the ketubah you could figure it out. But he says this is the factor. Iyamar havule. If he said give her, which actually he did, if you look back at the statement, but I guess they weren't really clear. Or he's saying clarify. If he said havule, give her, arba me'azuze de'inun tmane me'ea. So he's saying if he said give her, then it is the 400, because he said give her 400, and that teaches us that there must be 800 in the ketubah, and he's saying give her the 400. So we have to be careful of his wording in this final statement. If it was give her 400, then you give her 400, and we're assuming there's 800 in the ketubah. Iyamar tovula, if he said write for her, as opposed to give her, if he said write for her, arba me'ezuze de'inun matan. If he said write for her 400 zuzeh, then he only owes her 200. Okay? So he's saying, what did he say? Did he say give her? Or did he say write for her? Okay, so we were there in the room, right? Because it actually tells us what he said. He actually said give her, which seems to imply that he owes her 400. He owes the family 400, except it's not that simple. Okay.
It splits the difference.
Rarely that simple.
What's simple?
Yeah.
No, nothing in the Talmud is simple.
Yeah, and also you're assuming what I said is simple. But I mean, the simple answer is he owes 400. He owes 400 because he said give her and he didn't say write for her. Okay. Except that we may have heard Rav Ashi wrong. That's the issue. Okay. So Ika de Amre is an interesting formulation. That's what we have next. Is verse 8. When it says Ika de Amre, it means that there's another tradition of what happened in the Beit Midrash. So sometimes there's a different tradition of what happened in the case itself, a different set of facts. There's also a different memories of the conversation among the rabbis, because the ears are sometimes unreliable, and sometimes witnesses will remember things differently. You've probably come across that in your life before. People remember things differently. So when you have an Ika de Amre in the Talmud, it means different people remember that differently. Here's how I remember it. So we're gonna have that now. Here's how I remember it. Ika de Amre amar Rav Ashi. So I heard it differently from you. This is what I remember Rav Ashi saying. Chazenan. First of all, because Rav Ashi said, look, listen, carefully, figure out what he said. Iyamar lichtu bata. So it wasn't the issue, my memory of Rav Ashi saying, it wasn't the issue of did he say give or did he say write? The issue is what preposition did he use with the word ketubah? So lichtu bata means for her ketubah. So this dying guy on his deathbed, did he say for her ketubah? So if he said for a ketubah, arba ma'azuze de inan tamamena. So if he said, give her 400 for a ketubah, that means the ketubah said 800, and you're giving her 400 because you're just following the ketubah. So you're just following the ketubah. So he's basically on his deathbed. He said, following the ketubah, I'm giving her 400 for the ketubah because the ketubah was 800. If they would just say what they mean, it would be much easier for us. But but that's the way it goes. This was their custom. And in fairness, that's what the Talmud is discussing. The Talmud is discussing what do we do when people write contracts that really aren't valid, but we want to honor them because they didn't have rabbis available, because there were certain folk customs that they really respected, and we should respect them also. Okay. The EMR bichtubata. But if he said in her ketubah, as opposed to for her ketubah, if he said in her ketubah, then he's basically what he's saying is there's 400 in the ketubah, arme azuze. So that he's saying there's 400 in the ketubah, de'inu, which is matan, which is 200. And therefore he owns 200. So we have to figure out, did he say, and it's actually just a difference of one letter. It's either lichtubata or bichtubata. One little letter means $200, 200 zuz, okay? And then it says vilohi. And then it says that ika da'amre, actually that's not what happened at all. It was interesting to share it because it teaches us something, but that's not what happened at all. Lo shna de'amar lichtubata, v'lo shna de'amar bichtubata. It doesn't matter, the preposition. It doesn't matter if it said for the ketubah, with the ketubah, in the ketubah, through the ketubah, for the. It doesn't matter which preposition. Arba me'azuze de'inan matan. It would be, no matter what happens, if the word ketubah is in there, it's he only owes 200. There's 400 in the ketubah, which means he owes 200. Ad demar havule. The only thing that matters, if he said give her 400, then you give her. Anything else, if the subject is really about the ketubah, you assume the 400 is 200. As soon as he says give her 400, it means give her 400 exactly. Right, literally. Stama. Stama means 400 exactly, literally 400. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
In the modern day get, I understand it's not valid as far as with the laws, the secular law is
secular
concerned.
law, right?
But do you even get into these things at all in determining whether or not there's
the get? So you're talking about the divorce document, right? So right, the divorce document doesn't have financial obligations. It doesn't. It just says the only obligation in the get is that I can't prevent you from marrying somebody else. So the financial information that is in the ketubah is not referred to in the get, because the ketubah is actually the active document there. Mm-hmm. The bride would take the ketubah to the rabbis and say, hey, my husband owes me 200 zuz. And the get doesn't matter. You might have to take the get to prove there's actually a divorce. But the get, the get document doesn't mention the amount of money. But because remember, the amount of money is standard. It's statutory amount. Just because people exaggerate on it.
Okay, so there's no community property situation.
No, there's not. So they didn't have that. That develops later, and that's through civil law. And I guess different countries go about it different ways. But no, it wasn't like you split the estate. All the bride got was 200. Now, it's complicated because she would have come into the marriage with a certain amount of money. And the money that she came into the marriage with, she gets to keep. So that's a whole different story, and that's a complicated set of laws. But there wasn't like we may have today, where in a civil divorce in the United States, all things being equal, you just split in half because it's community property. So they didn't have that. What they had was a certain amount of money that the bride would get to go on her way, and probably to get remarried, and the groom would keep the rest.
I mean, there are equivalents in the Middle East. Women get gold.
Is that right?
And then at the divorce, they get to keep the gold.
Yeah.
This gold jewelry is.
Yeah, I mean, there's tractates in the Talmud about this too. A woman could accumulate money during the marriage. She didn't have to turn over all the money to the husband, and she could certainly bring money in, so she could have separate accounts. But there was no community property, right? Yeah, she could gift them to her husband. So anyway, that's a different subject. Okay, page 159.4. And this is a different. We're done now with the ketubah discussion, but it's still, the issue is honoring these lay contracts, and some interesting stories and laws here. Ahu gavra, again. So here's another case. Dikibel ara mechavre. So a person leased land from his fellow. That's the dikabel. It means he didn't buy it or purchase it. He leased it, the leasing arrangement. And remember, the leasing arrangements could be all sorts of different mechanisms, but this looks like it was a percentage. Okay, so you give the owner of the field a percentage of the crop, of the profit. Okay? And so Amar, he says, I'm presuming here it means this is in a document. This is a contract. So it says in the contract, Imo varnale, yahavnale alpha zuze. If I let this land lie fallow, I'll give you 1,000 zuz. Okay? 1,000 zuz is a lot of money. So there's 200 zuz as the statutory amount in the ketubah, which is a lot of money. 200 zuz is a lot of money. It's a good middle-class yearly salary. You can live well. In these times, 200 zuz a year. So 1,000 zuz is 5 times that much. It's a lot of money. Okay? So what he says is that if I let this land lie fallow, I will give you 1,000 zuz. Okay? Now, unfortunately, we're encountering the same cultural issues that we've encountered with the ketubah, is that he's exaggerating. He doesn't really mean it, but it's in the contract. I didn't mean that. So yeah, it's like I'll say, yeah, you know what? I'll give you $1 billion if I don't work this land. If I let this land lie fallow, I'm so confident I'll give you $1 billion. Okay, and then he doesn't lie. Then the land lies fallow. So let's go on anyway. Amrei Nahar. Okay. What happened is Ovir Tilta. Okay. Now a third of the land he didn't work. So that's a third of the land that the owner is missing profit on. Right? Because the owner gets a profit, gets money. It's a source of revenue for the owner. That's why he's leasing the land. And the lessee has guaranteed that he's going to work the whole land. And now he doesn't work the whole land. There's a third of the land that he doesn't work, and he promised 1,000 zuz.
So a third would be.
Well, that would be the logical.
But has he promised?
Yes, well, that's the whole question.
I mean, because it just says, "I'll work the land." You could have worked 1 square foot, and he worked the land.
Yeah, well, you're getting Talmudic now. Right?
Yes, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, right. Let's see. So let's see what the rabbis say. So Amrei Nehardei. So the rabbis of Nehardea is a Babylonian community. This is the Babylonian Talmud. Most of this stuff takes place in Babylonia. So the rabbis of Nehardea said, Dinahu, the law is, Diyahiv le tlatmea utlatin utlata batilta. Okay, so rabbinic math. A third of the land you didn't work. You promised 1,000 if you let the entire land lie fallow. So if there are math experts here, what's the third? 333 and 1/3, 0.333. Goes on forever. All right, we'll round it off at 333 and 1/3. That's what you owe. That's what you owe the landlord, because you promised 1,000, and you don't owe the whole 1,000 because you worked 2/3 of the land, but you have to pay. Okay, but Rava said no, and here's the real complicated thing, and fortunately we don't really have this in American law, but in the Near East, Babylonian times, seems to have been more Babylonian, by the way, than Palestinian, than the land of Israel. But Babylonia, this seems to be part of the culture. Rava Amar, asmachtahi. So Rava says, it's a peculiar thing. It's hard to translate. It's called asmachta. And you can see this concept on you see that where it says concepts on the right side?
Yeah.
So I'll tell you, I mean, he didn't mean it. It's an exaggeration. I was just asmachta literally means supporting. I was just supporting our contract, our relationship, what we did together, with an exaggeration. I was telling you, I'm quite sure that I will be able to work this land, but I didn't really mean the 1,000, and I didn't mean it, because where am I going to get 1,000 zuz? And you understood that when we signed the contract, we had an informal understanding that I didn't really mean it. So all that stuff is an asmachta. That's an asmachta. Asmachta means I said it as support for my certainty, but I didn't mean that I had a contractual obligation to give you this money. Now, I'll read a little bit of Steinsaltz. Asmachta, an obligation which a person undertakes, but does not expect to be called upon to fulfill. Right, so it's an exaggeration. I don't know how else to say it. And there's a cultural issue here, too. So it's very foreign to us, our litigious society. We can't imagine this, but it wasn't so uncommon back then. Yeah. And since, I've had some experience, and we all have, too, with different cultures, it's not that as foreign as we think. There are places that exaggerate. I remember reading a book about, I may have mentioned this before, but a guy that took a taxi ride in Tehran not that long ago, 15, 20 years ago, took a taxi ride in Tehran. Did I tell the story before? I mean, I forgot what. So anyhow, so you take it, and there's not a lot of Americans go now to Tehran, or 20 years ago, but people do. I mean, it's possible to travel there, and often the people that go are children of Iranians, and there's Iranian Jews that go there too. It's not impossible to go. So so you take a taxi from the airport, and then take out your wallet and say, how much do I owe you? And the taxi driver says, oh, it's nothing. You don't owe me anything. That's the polite thing to say. Now if you get out of the car without paying, that's a breach of etiquette. But it's a gross breach of etiquette. You pay that taxi driver, but it's a negotiation. So the taxi driver is obligated by etiquette to say, I wouldn't charge you. You don't owe me anything. And then you have to say back, oh no, I'll give you $1,000. And it goes back and forth. And you in the culture you understand.
What it's worth.
Right, that's right. So it's just, it's just part of the, but that's part of learning the culture too. So, and keep in mind the Babylonian Talmud is written in that part of the world. So these are time-honored customs, which, the West has different ways of expressing itself. So we have weird stuff too, by the way.
I'm just trying to picture New York City. In New York City, the cab saying, oh no, you don't owe me anything.
I will say there's some of it in Israel. You get some of it in Israel, because people come from different parts of the world, and sometimes in a cab in Israel, so how much do you want to pay? What do you mean how much do you want to pay? I mean, Westerners there should be a meter. Now Israel's done a lot in reforming their taxi system, but it wasn't that long ago, 20, 30 years ago. You didn't know, so that's it. And Jews came from that part of the world, and that was their culture. So this stuff, this is smachta. I mean, you have it in the Talmud, but obviously it was a concept that existed. So the rabbis who had to adjudicate had to take it into consideration. So the rabbis of Nehardea, you can see they didn't have any patience for it. They said, no, it was 1,000 zuz. He said 1,000 zuz. So it was a third of that. But Rava comes on and says, no, he didn't mean it. It's an asmachta. You and I know what asmachtas are.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting.
Is that a Hebrew word?
Yeah, it's Aramaic, but it's from the Hebrew. The Hebrew it's good Hebrew. It's samach, which means to rely. Support.
Yeah.
Yes, support. By the way, a derivation of that word is smicha. Smicha. So what smicha is rabbinic ordination. So where does that come from? Because your teacher, in order to make you a rabbi, your teacher lays his hands on you and presses. So supports you, like in effect, symbolically is supporting. I support you in your becoming a rabbi. And the teacher actually lays the hands on the person. So and when there was a sacrifice in the temple, the priest would have to, the person giving the sacrifice, the layperson, would put his hands on the sacrifice, supporting the sacrifice to show, this is my animal I'm giving over to the priest. So it comes from the word support. So it's a statement here. The asmachta is a statement in support of the obligation, but you don't expect the details itself to be adjudicated. It's just a way that I am articulating my obligation, which is to work the field.
What's the shorsh?
Samach men chaf.
Samach
Mem chaf. Yeah.
It's interesting. This gives light to something I noticed when I was dealing with some Iranian or Iraqi Jews who had moved here. And when you would go into a contract with them, you had to go in with the understanding that this was just an invitation to negotiate later.
Yeah.
Because the terms really didn't mean anything.
Over a cup of tea, of course.
Yeah. Yes.
No, I don't remember the tea.
Yeah. But that's important.
Yeah.
No, but
I remember the attorney. It's not
But
the tea.
even in America, I mean, like kids say, cross my heart and hope to die.
Yeah.
You don't really hope to die.
Yeah. Right. I'll kill you if you do that again.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
So
an
yeah. So
exaggeration
right.
of your commitment.
Yeah. So the human propensity to exaggerate is very real. It's something we see in everyday conversation all the time. So that's why this stuff is not as weird as you might think. It's just that it's that human propensity to exaggerate that's just translated to the legal field. And the rabbis who are, the judges have to deal with that.
What's weird, I mean, I can understand somebody saying this. It's a saying. It's just because communication by voice often is inexact.
Yeah, right.
But when you're writing a contract, it's
yeah.
meant to be exact.
Yeah.
And so that's what's strange.
Right.
Is that there's this there's meaning underneath that you have to know, and if you don't know the culture, you don't know the meaning.
Yeah.
You know the territory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this was much less of a multicultural world in those days too. So you had you had firm local customs where
Everybody understands.
people understood. Right. So this wouldn't work if this was an odd case. Oh, I didn't mean it. What do you mean you didn't mean it? You wrote it in the contract. But if everybody in the culture understands asmachta, if it's a widely accepted concept, then it's actually not complicated or difficult at all.
And what's the purpose of having a contract? Why you can
Yeah, so hold off on that. I mean, because
That's yes.
yeah, that's why you have things,
Elephant in the
because that's why
room.
you have law too. So law would always overturn the contract too. So there are minimum amounts. I mean, that's why you have the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says it doesn't matter what you have in the contract. This is what you owe the landowner. We're setting standards for leasing, which your contracts can't overcome anyway. So you do have, and the same thing that happens in the ketubah too. I don't care what you wrote in your ketubah. This is what you owe the bride. So you end up with law, which is bottom line.
But this is legislation that's not by, I mean, it's by an unselected person, basically.
Yeah, all right. I don't want to. This is
You could go all the way.
exactly, and also some of these questions get answered in the later, so I don't want to go through too much of it right now. I'm going to just finish a sentence and we'll end for the day. And now there's an objection to Rava. So just like you all have objections too. So there's an objection to Rava. Ula Rava. And for Rava. So here's a question for Rava. My shna mehaditnan. So for Rava, they're quoting, but we have this law already. Im ovir velo aved. Okay. So if he lets the land lie fallow and he doesn't work the land, ashalem b'meitava. He does have to pay the owner, because he promised that he would work the land. He has to pay the owner, and not just pay the owner. In the next year's crop, he has to pay the owner from the best crops. So here's another cultural issue too that we have to understand, is that it was much less of a cash society in those days. That's another reason why 1,000 zuz would be a huge amount, because very often people didn't have money at all, and they dealt with stuff, and the stuff they would deal with would be crops. So if I owe the owner 1,000 zuz, I'm not like I'm going to write a check or pay in cash. I'm going to pay in apples. So it might be translated into 500 apples, but there's difference in quality in apples, so it would have to be the best apple. So this Mishnah, so the challenge to Rava is, but wait a second, we have a law that if you let the land lie fallow, you do have to pay the owner a certain amount, and when you pay the owner, you have to pay from the best of your crops. So suddenly it's not, because generally when you pay the owner a percentage of the crop, you're paying from the middle level, because there's some good apples, there's bad apples, and there's a middle level, and you're paying from the middle level. So as a penalty for letting the land lie fallow, the following year, when you do it, you have to pay the owner. So you do have to pay the owner back something. So Rava's saying you don't have to pay him anything, because he didn't mean it. It was just an asmachta. But we actually have a law that says you do have to pay the owner, and you have to pay the owner a significant amount. All right, so Rava has to respond to that. We'll wait till next week.